So what I'm trying to do is give you some tips, because the most important thing, and I've moved these slides to the end, because normally I start off with why is performance important, and is it important? And the answer is no, not as important as getting your script to actually do what it needs to do. And if it takes 5 hours to do that, as long as it's not mission critical and you need it to run in 5 minutes, that's absolutely fine. If you want to make it run in half the time, maybe, but again, some things to do in terms of good performance and some things to do in terms of, well, do I actually need to thrash this machine, particularly if other people are on that machine? So how do I actually optimize it so it doesn't use all the CPU cycles? Well, the first thing, and I see a lot of this, is with inside a loop, somebody's calculating something. So the classic one is if you're comparing something with a date time, and that date time isn't changing, so you've got a parameter to your script that says, find me everything that was 7 days ago. So you do a date time, add days, -7, but do that outside your loop, yeah? You don't do it inside a loop. I mean, if you're doing the loop a couple of times, doesn't matter, but if you're doing that loop hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times, I've just had one of my scripts for a new customer run this week across 4 days, because it got 342,000 files to iterate over. So this is where performance is important. But if you always program with those ideas in mind, it will help you scale your code if you need to anyway. So always think performance, but even before we think performance, we think security, don't we? We always think security. How could this go wrong? How could this break? Yeah? So set things in variables once, if they're static, outside of the loop. Yeah? Again, I'm going to cut down on the demos. Normally, if you've seen any of my sessions online, I do more demos than I do PowerPoint. But 30 minutes, particularly if I keep talking about it being 30 minutes, is going to be a very short amount of time. Another thing, I don't mention write host here because I don't use write host very often. At least in PowerShell 5, we can redirect it now because it's just one of the numbered streams. If you follow me on Twitter, I put out a tweet this week about how to redirect the various streams. Standard output is stream 1, standard error is stream 2, warning is stream 3, and then I forget, but write host is stream 6, and it uses Unix syntax. But even with write base, if you're iterating over something 10,000 times, do you want to say, right, I'm doing item 1 now, I'm doing item 2 now, I'm doing item 3 now? Because if that's running, maybe that's running in a remote VM in Azure with an MSTSC or something like that. Oh, yeah, it's got to display. It's got to send that display information over as well as doing the calculating. Where does it do that? Oh, in the CPU on the machine where it's running. Yeah. So maybe you do an integer calculation and say, well, actually, I'm only going to write progress every 10 steps, every 100 steps. Have you ever used invoke web request in PowerShell 5 to download a file where it does a write progress every byte? Yeah, don't do that. Guess what they've fixed in PowerShell 7? I don't know what it is, but it only does it every K or something like that, because that write progress slows that download of a file massively. There are other ways to do it, using the web client .NET class. So yes, it's great to have information there with these techniques, so at least you can turn them off. Yeah, so you can turn progress off easily. You can turn, might have verbose on normally, whereas write output write output or write host are not great for debug messages, because you've got to go and disable them, or you've got to put ifs around them. Why would you put an if around a write host? Just use write verbose or write information or write debug. Yeah, use the channels smartly to get debug information out. This is one not a lot of people know. How many people know about where method on collections? A few. Good. So all collections, even the simple array, has a where method on it. So I can filter stuff. Yeah. So normally you pipe it through where-object. You're allowed to type where. You certainly can't put a question mark in a script. Yeah. We don't use aliases in scripts. We all agree with that. Yeah, because it makes the readability difficult. So what we've got there, now we'll demo this one if I can find a PowerShell window with a decent size font. Yeah. Oh, good old Control Plus. You've got a like terminal, haven't you? So if I get an array in a variable, so let's call it $files. Oh, let's have caps lock on as well. That always helps. And I get some files. Okay, I'm using it interactively, so I'm allowed to get away with using aliases. I wouldn't use ls in a script, but again, say I come from a Unix background, ls, ps, that sort of stuff. So that's now an array, yeah? And we can see that. Of course, we're not case sensitive either, which is one of the nice things about PowerShell, except for a few things that just catch you out with case sensitivity in PowerShell, which is lovely. So what I could do is, let's say, $files where name minus match. Notice I'm not using curly braces because it's PowerShell 3, and that's slightly faster as well. If you've got simple expressions, don't use the curly braces. It will make it slightly faster. I didn't even put that in the notes, but I'm trying to distill what I do on a daily basis, because that's all I do is write PowerShell, into slides and demos. So yeah, don't use curly braces unless you've got something complex. You know, if you have to do an AND, or if it's a sub-property, then you will have to use curly braces. But if it's just a simple single expression, don't use curly braces as long as you can run on PowerShell 3 and above, which you go, but it can't run. I still have to get shouted at by one of my customers if I write stuff which doesn't run on PowerShell 2. Because they've got Windows, their customers, because they're a software vendor, have Windows 7 unpatched, never updated, and have PowerShell 2 on them. Oh, the pain. I charge them extra for that. Let's see if there's anything that matches Guy in here. Oh, regular expressions. He's done a regular expression. Everybody duck. Yeah, that regular expression matches Guy. Yeah, regular expressions aren't scary. That's one of my other talks. Yeah. Okay, there aren't any in there. Yes. How do I get around that? I do a set strict mode. Mine is version latest. Well, so I did that deliberately, obviously, just to see if you were all still paying attention. That's why I develop it with strict mode on. If you don't use that one, that's why I develop. I never put that in my scripts to actually set it, but when I'm developing, it should be in my profile. I need to see why that's not in my profile. So that if I accidentally do something, that will give me an error. Yeah. So I realise that I've been a Muppet, and it will tell me, Guy, you've been a Muppet. That's what red means. Yeah. You've been a Muppet, which obviously we know sends people using your scripts running away. Control left arrow to dodge a word at a time rather than just pressing cursor back. Yeah, and we have got some that match where. So Control L, quick way to clear. But this time what I'm going to do is $files. Well, we can actually see the methods, of course, if we pipe it through good old get method with a large font which scrolls. But you can see we've got where has it gone? I don't know, but I'm going to use it anyway, so I don't care. So $files where, but this time I do have to use curly braces because it's a script block. So, and I do use a $_ name minus match Guy. I'll use those quotes this time. So same as where object. What's the difference? That is generally faster. Yeah. Because it's a method rather than having to set up a pipeline. Pipelines generally are expensive, not in terms of how much it costs you, but performance to set up a pipeline to put stuff from here to the other side of the pipeline. So probably another performance tip, avoid pipelines where possible. The downside with that, which can catch you out, is, and this generally catches people out anyway, and I think I've actually done this accidentally on purpose, is good old PowerShell, you know, it flattens single object arrays. So you think, this is going to return an array. And it doesn't, because there's only one item. And PowerShell helpfully flattens that to a single object. So if you start asking, what's the count of this? It'll go, count not found. So what I did here was I actually forced it to an array. So even if there's only one file, so whenever I'm having an array, I will always wrap it with that at parentheses. In fact, something else people don't like about what I do in my PowerShell, because I come from C++ where everything has to be typed, as in you have to tell what type a variable is, you know, I will always type something as an array as well. Well, people go, well, you've got that means it's an array. Yeah, but that tells me definitely it's an array. So I always type my things, or technically we call them variables, so that I know it's an array. Just makes it easier to read the code, and if you've got logic errors, it will help spot those as well. So that's something else I do. So that can be faster, but where will always return an array. Even if there's one object, it will still return an array. So you need to make sure your code deals with arrays, but it's much easier to make your code always deal with arrays by default, just in case there's more than one. But you say, hold on, I only want one. You know, if someone's given me a config file, I want to make sure there's only one of those. But that's where you still force it to an array, and you do a count of it. And if the count's greater than 1, or the count's not equal to 1, you throw an exception, you get out of there. Yeah, again, different talk, but as soon as you get a fatal error, you get the hell out of Dodge, yeah? You don't then let the script carry on, and there's pages and pages of red errors, which I've had with some customers. So I've got this script someone's given me, and I've got pages of errors, yeah, because you've got a fatal error there where it can't find the configuration file, which means the script can't do its work, but the script carries on. Yeah? As soon as you've got a fatal error, get the hell out of there. But I've got a different talk about that, maybe next year, if I ever get invited back. But I've not made any of my bad dad jokes yet, so we're good, hopefully. Okay, so that's where, and there's a for each as well. So there's a for each method, so I can do that instead of the for each object. But you've got to think about where's your data. So if you're pipelining stuff, for each object has an advantage because you don't need everything to have been fetched before it will start putting into the pipeline. Yeah? So I'm getting 1,000 items. If you pipe in for each object, it can start processing when the first item's back. Whereas if you assign to an array like I did with the ls, the get child item, or dir of the files, I've got all of them back before I start processing. So for each method there will be quicker, but I've had to get everything back. So it's had to fetch all 1,000 files. Or with this customer I was doing, running my script, I tested in my lab with 10 files. He suddenly goes, I'm going to run it on 342,000 files. Okay, cross our fingers. 4 days later, done the phase one, worked through all the 342,000 files, no problem. It slowed down, probably data structures, because I hadn't really thought about it scaling to that size, and then failed at phase 2 straight away. But why was that? Because copy item failed because of some file system problem. Wasn't my fault, but I should have built retries in there. Yeah, retries with a back off, bit like robocopy does, if you know robocopy. And there is another optimization. Instead of for each object, has anybody ever used this technique? So rather than piping through for each object, you pipe through dot, open curly brace, process. You put your main code in here, is exactly as you would put it in the for each object script block. I forget where I got that from. It wasn't my idea. Again, with all this PowerShell community stuff, we always borrow ideas from everywhere else. We try and put a comment in saying, thank you, whatever, this is where I got this code from, rather than pretending it's yours. But if we put our script block in there, then that, particularly for a large number of items, I found that can work quicker than piping through for each object. Again, if I had time, I'd do a demo of that. Probably got some scripts on GitHub that got an example of that. But yeah, it is generally faster. And then the flip side of loops is, if this loop's going like this, is that great? Where are you running it? If you're running it on a dedicated machine, fine, but if you're running it on a machine that you have to share with other people, that's probably not so great. So you've done all these optimizations and the script can run really fast, but to the detriment of everybody else trying to do anything on that server. That's less of a problem these days because most of the stuff we do is probably single-threaded. I won't get to the stuff on multi-threaded in here because that's another way to make run spaces and for each parallel in in PowerShell 7 helps do that stuff. So if I've got to go query, do stuff against 100 machines, because I do a lot of sort of admin stuff because of my Citrix EUC background, then if I want to go doing stuff against 100 machines, I want to go do it all across 100 machines and tell me when you're finished, rather than do machine 1, machine 2, do it sequentially. That's going to take a long time. Yeah. So that's another way we can optimize. But consider actually, if your job isn't time critical, actually sleeping for a bit in there. Yeah? Remember, start sleep can take a milliseconds argument. You don't have to sleep in whole seconds. You can sleep a number of milliseconds. Yeah? So you might think, okay, I'm just going to reduce the CPU slightly. I'm going to sleep for 10 milliseconds. Except, of course, you wouldn't hard code it in your loop. You would have a parameter probably in your parameter block with a default of 10. So if somebody wanted to say, actually, no, I don't want to sleep, they can pass a 0 across, which won't sleep. Yeah? Hard coding is the devil's work. Yeah? That's why if you look at any of my scripts on GitHub, 140 or something at last count, the parameter blocks are about that big, even with a very small font. Why? Because I make anything that could be hard coded, I make a parameter and I make it a default value. So actually the number of parameters you need to specify is that. The actual number you could specify is that, because all the other optional ones have a default value. So you just leave it unless you want to tweak it. Makes it a pain when you come to write the help block, which is always the last thing I do before I release stuff. Oh God, I've got to write the help block now. Particularly as I don't use VS Code, so I know that can help me. Yeah, I will stop being a Luddite at one point. And another thing we can do, because I come from a sort of performance management background in a Windows space, or even before that in Unix, we can actually reduce the priority of the process. So if you're doing something and you want other people to get a bigger share of the processor, you can actually set your processor, everything by default is normal. So you set your own, so that's your PID in the script, so you run this in the script, that sets your own priority to below normal, which is 1 below normal. And the way the Windows scheduler works is if anybody needs the CPU, it looks at their process priority. So if, let's say this is actually, we've not done a start sleep, this is absolutely killing your CPU, but if something comes along at normal or higher, says I need some CPU, if there isn't a core or vCPU available for it, it will actually context switch and kick it off and go, no, you have to wait because you're a lower priority. So what that means is, if the machine is idle, this can have all the CPU. But if someone's trying to use the machine interactively with Word or something like that, then they can do as well. As long as their Word is below normal, which it will be by default, they can get the CPU. Yeah. So performance is 2 things. Dedicated machine, yeah, thrash the hell out of it. You've got to share it with other people, like yourself. If you're going to run it on your own laptop, on your own machine, run a VM in Azure or elsewhere, or in your own private cloud, or my garage where I've got a Dell rack mount running 24/7, but I'm on a fixed energy tariff at the moment. I might change that come June when that stops being fixed. I've seen that in somebody's example code today already. I didn't see it in yours, sir. Yeah, that can be a bad thing. Yeah, plus equals to add stuff to an existing variable. Where is it particularly bad? Arrays. Yeah. Why did the programmer quit his job? Because he didn't get a raise. Oh. Sorry, I've got to put at least one dad joke in. Because every time you add something to an array, it takes a full copy of the array as the new item and then adds the item to it. It doesn't just insert one item at the end for the built-in array type. Yeah. Same for strings. So if you're using a small string, probably doesn't matter. But if you've got some massive string, maybe a hash of something, or some of these large values you seem to get in Azure, again, when you do a plus equals to append something to it, it takes a full copy of the string. You're doing that thousands of times in a loop. It's going to use, well, it's not so much to use more memory because it will clean up the memory, but it's going to take longer because it's got to copy the whole thing. Allocate the memory, copy it, free up the memory. Yeah. Hash tables, they're exempt. If you do a plus equals on a hash table, it will just add the 2 hash tables together. It won't take a copy. So that is okay for hash tables. And it's also okay for simple integers, yeah? $i, which I never use $i. It's called $index, yeah, if it's an index. If it's a count, it's called $count, not $c. It's never $x. I never use single letter variable names. I did in my Commodore career when I had 3.5K of RAM to deal with, and my VIC-20 back in the 80s. But now there's no excuse, particularly with IntelliSense and autocomplete and control space, which is, if you don't use that, is pattern matching on steroids. Then, use meaningful identifier names. Set strict mode will help you spot when you've got a typo. So you make this really great name, but you've typoed it. There are some words, as you know, that you always get wrong. The set strict mode minus version latest, when you've actually typed it right because you didn't tab complete it, will tell you, oh, this doesn't exist. You go, it doesn't. Oh yeah, I've got the I and the O the wrong way around. Oh, never done that myself, obviously. All my code's always perfect. So how do we work around this for arrays? Well, the way I do it quite often is just assign all my results to an array. I mean, you've already seen an example of me doing that. There. That's assigning an array because that's taking the output stream, what's on the pipeline, and putting it into a variable. And you can just extend that. So if I go to one of my customer scripts, if I could pick the right one. Yes, this is ISE. There we go. So here, again, in fact, I'm forcing, well, not necessarily forcing, but stating the type. Then I'm creating, this is one that creates some AVD VMs in Azure. It's doing a loop. VM counter, not $i. Again, that's a different presentation. Lecture. I'm saying everything here is going to be assigned to an array. Yeah, and further on down this script, when I've done some stuff, So again, when I'm outputting to the pipeline, I actually put a comment. You've heard of comments? You use them every now and again. Don't use comments to state the bleeding obvious. Comment in here. Write warning that it failed to create a VM. Yeah, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah? So suddenly your code becomes twice as long because you comment every line. If you use meaningful messages and meaningful variable names, the code does become self-documenting to a degree. But if you've struggled with something to get it to work, you've tried something that didn't work, put your comments in, oh, I tried this, but it didn't work because of this. Yeah? Because if somebody else comes to take that script, oh, I know a better way of doing it. 3 hours later, and you go, why didn't you use this guy? Oh, yeah, didn't I say? Yeah, that method didn't work. Yeah, leave a comment. So this is the line where I'm actually outputting my job. So again, this just does some Azure stuff, but actually does it an as job. So this is how I'm getting parallelization with Azure stuff. So I can do, which is kind of relevant to the topic as well. So this script can take a count parameter, which is number of VMs to create. If I create 10 VMs, it actually comes through this loop once, creates a VM, puts it in here, which is standard output, actually adds a property to the object as well, calculated properties, love calculated properties, so you can add extra stuff to an existing, so that returns a job object, but I'm actually perverting it and adding something to it. You have to be careful when you use it, you can't actually wait for this object later, because it's not a job object, because it comes a PS custom object, but it contains an ID, so you wait for the ID instead. But yeah, I can do this 10 times, so my array becomes 10 items, and then I've suddenly parallelized 10, Azure, here, make these 10 VMs, and it can do them in parallel. So I can just use simple jobs. Jobs aren't great for short running things, that's why I use run spaces, but for Azure, Azure, you go and do the parallelization. Yeah, you can build 10 VMs in parallel, I hope, depending on the time of day and availability and all this sort of stuff. So at the end of there, I will get, so I'm using for each. Oh, look, I'm assigning to an array again. So I wait for the job somewhere. Yeah, so this is where I'm having to wait for the actual IDs. I can't wait for the jobs because they're not jobs anymore because I added that custom property. I have to wait for the ID, but it can wait for IDs as well as jobs, which is fine. And then I just iterate over those. Yeah, so it does all the hard work, and then again, I look at these tuning jobs because I like to report to my users whether it was good, bad, or ugly. Later on, I'll go and get each job and go, did it work? Did it not? Let me give them some error context, yeah? Give them as much information as I can so they can troubleshoot. There's another thing, which is a slightly different presentation. In your catch block, don't go, if you've got an exception handler, don't go, there was a problem. Yeah, thanks. Could you give me a clue what sort of problem it was? Was it access didn't? Yeah, an error occurred. Bad thing happened. Yeah, great. Give me a bit more detail, please, to help me debug it. Sir? We're not talking 1,000%, but we're certainly talking in double digits last time I did any tests. Because I'm not doing these just to be nuanced and, oh, guy does some funky stuff. Yeah, there's logic behind this, because some of my scripts, certainly if you know control up, they're a performance tool vendor, I write scripts, and sometimes I have to iterate over tens of thousands of objects quickly. So I've learned some ways of using things like some of the profiling modules from Jakob or Matthias, just to see where the slow bits are, and then you get to learn where they are. But say this is, I know I've already shown you this. I wrap it to avoid this lovely flattening feature, which catches you out a few times. But what you can also do is use the built-in .NET collections types. Don't use the non-generic ones because they've been deprecated, not depreciated, a different word completely. The generic ones, which if they're strings, you put strings, but generally you just, because they're template classes, we have to tell it what it is, and you just call it an object, which works for everything. Then many of you use the generic collections. They're better because you can use add methods, yeah? And over the non-generic ones, the add method doesn't return anything, so you don't even have to assign it to null or pipe it to out null, which again is expensive. Remember, setting up pipes is expensive, or cast it to void. They've got add methods, they've got remove methods, because they're built in arrays. You try and add something to it, what do you get? Arrays of a fixed size. How many times have we hit that, yeah? And we can remove things. The thing to remember, though, is if you're iterating over an array, you generally do it by index, iterate backwards. Because if you're iterating forwards and removing items, you mess up the array that you're iterating over. Yeah? You've got to item 2, you delete it, poor old iterator, then go, well, I'm lost here. Whereas if you go backwards, if you delete the last item, fine, because you're going to go to the next to last item. So if you're doing any removes, but again, that's not a performance thing, that's a logic thing. Yeah, don't use these types of collections, the non-generic ones, because they are deprecated. I don't think they said they're going to drop support, but there's no development on them. These are much better, and some pretty funky ones in here as well that you can use. And if you want to see what sort of types there are in there, go, what types? Well, you can RTFM. We all know what RTFM means, don't we? Read that in manual. But we can also, if I do a new object, mine is name, system.collections. If I put an M in system as well, that generally helps, I've been told. Are you going to tab complete? Oh, you are going to tab complete. Dot generic. I'll tell you, shall I call it collections? Because that's better, isn't it? The way these computers are so literal, aren't they? You know what? I know what I mean. What did I do then? What key sequence did I hit? Control space. Yeah, control space. Every time I do a presentation, I use control space. There's always somebody who goes, "Oh, I didn't know about that," and it's fantastic for all sorts of things. But this will show you what you've got available. And look, I can even cursor through them. Yeah. So go and pick the various types if I want. So control space is brilliant for parameters, to commandlets, to types, to file names. Yeah, you can do an ls star.ps1 control space or ls star hash star, and it will show you all the scripts that match, all the files that match hash, and you can go and select them. Yeah. Again, I digress. I always do other things when I'm supposed to be talking about one particular topic, but trying to get through all this stuff in one go. I know I'm kind of half an hour in, but I think I think it'd be better for me, actually for you, because it's all about you, not about me, if I just carry on and you throw questions in as we go. That way I'll cover some more material. Yeah, is that okay? I throw questions in or your own observations, because I always learn things from these sessions as well, because people go, "Oh, what about this? Oh, I didn't know about that." Yeah, I learn stuff every day. I forget stuff every day, but that's an age thing. Yeah, that's what OneNote's for. And then just some last quick notes about how do we add ways to stuff to strings. There's various ways to do it with string manipulation, so we don't use old string plus equals. Yeah, if old string's short, just use it. But always think, oh, what if this does get really long? Yeah, if you're dealing with a computer name which is never going to be more than 15 characters because that breaks NetBIOS, then you're fine. But if you're going to use something that could be 4,000 characters long, yeah, think about performance. Always think about performance when you code it, because it's easier to write it as you go than to come back and think, oh, why is this running slow? Why is this broken? Yeah. Same for security. Caching data. This is something that's particularly relevant these days with Azure, but I've been doing it for a long time with Citrix and other bits where you'd go and get stuff, or Active Directory even. Rather than, if I'm iterating over 10,000 users, let's say I've got 10,000 users from a CSV, am I going to go and get each user one at a time through get AD user if I'm using the Active Directory module? Or shall I actually go and get all the users, all 5,000 of them, in one go, cache them, and then use that cache when I want to look up an individual user? Yeah, that's going to be a lot faster than calling get AD user, particularly if you've got a remote domain or you're over a slow link or something like that. And how do we cache it? The easiest way, I find, is to use hash tables, which can cause it to slow down. And I think that's what I saw with my customer this week when he was running his 342,000 files through this particular script I wrote for him. And that it was a mixture of hash tables and arrays. And I think even though there's plenty of memory and the CPU was quite low and there's plenty of disk space, it slowed down over time. I think just the data structures slowed down. Now, he hadn't told me he was going to run it with hundreds of thousands of files. Otherwise, I might have thought, well, maybe I'll split these, because I'm basically reading the results in, which is basic caching file system information, so I don't later have to go and read the files again. So maybe I'd split it into, have a different hash table for each letter of the alphabet, or you can split it a number of different ways. So you're dealing with a larger number of smaller collections. There are different ways you can do that. But one of the things is, if you don't need all the properties of something, don't cache them all, because let's say you take my example of ls, the get child item at the start, has got this many properties, which might be useful. But if you're only interested in these two properties, if you're having a cache of a couple of them, doesn't matter. But if you're caching 342,000, it does make a difference.
If you've got your object
Yeah, it's difficult to say. What I would tend to do is have a test bed where everybody get the question, whether it's better to select objects or whether you would make a new object, a PS custom object with those three properties and then output that. It's difficult to say. I tend to use select object, but that starts a pipe, so that can be slow, but PS custom object, or even start with a hash table and then convert it to a custom object. There are different ways to do it. It's a good question, actually. Yeah.
Custom object, but when I've been lazy and just used calculated properties rather than adding properties.
Yes. I suspect the overhead of calculated properties isn't insignificant, but as I said earlier on, I love calculated properties as well, so it really depends what you're doing. There's a couple of other things we can do with memory. You can trim your own working set. What does that mean? That means the memory that you're not using. So if I've got 342,000, then the first 200,000 I'm not going to get to for phase two for probably hours or days. So if you what's called trim your own working set, what it does is take the memory, writes it to the page file, and then only if it needs it does it bring it back. And there are APIs for that. If you look on my GitHub, there's a script called trimmer.ps1. Basically, it's just a wrapper for a Windows API. Set process working set size, and you can reduce your working set, and it'll push it out. And particularly these days with SSDs, instead of spinning disks, even if stuff is paged out, the expense of getting it back isn't too bad. If you're not using stuff, destroy them. Remove variables, set them to null. Yeah. So if you've built up something with a temporary data structure and you've sucked some things out of it, delete it. Yeah. Set it to null, because again, PowerShell memory management should tidy that up for you rather than just leaving it lying around. Yeah, these are the sorts of things when you program at scale. Perhaps I should have titled this programming at scale. And there's this, which is a bit nasty, garbage collector. Force it to go and do stuff. I've only used that a few times because that'll use .NET underneath to go and think, oh, that's not being used, that's not being used. But I come from a C++ background where generally you allocate stuff and you have to be responsible for freeing it, otherwise you have memory leaks. So I'm better trained, perhaps. Hash tables for the caching is better. Let me just give you an example of some code there. I suppose last session of the day, I can just go on forever, can't I? Yeah, you do, Guy. It always sounds like it, even in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Very kind of you to say. So here's some Azure code. I've got, at the top up here, images is an empty hash table. Now, and what I'm doing is basically I'm looking up a particular ID of something. It happens to be a image ID for a session host in a AVD host pool, but it doesn't matter what it is, it's a unique ID. Yeah. You can do this straight away. Yeah, you could say I'm going to assign it. So this is my cache, my hash table, and I'm keying it on this custom image ID. So I could get it straight away. And so if that's null, it means, oh, I haven't got it in my cache. I'm going to go away and get it. So why am I doing a contains key as well? Because that might be quite expensive, because it's effectively doing the same thing. Contains key is saying, does it contain this key? If it does, then go and get it. But I could do that in one operation by doing this. Anybody think why I'm doing that? The reason I'm doing that, sorry, we haven't got time to wait and think about it. I'd love to do that. So I like to make these things interactive. Is what if I can't get that item? What if that item I've gone to get doesn't exist? What I don't want to do is every iteration I see it going, oh, does it exist? No, it doesn't. Oh, does it exist? No, it doesn't. So this is the difference between something not being there and something being null, which is subtly different. If you've been bitten by that, you'll go, yeah, I've been bitten by. So contains key, even if the value for that, because a hash table is a dictionary, which is a key and a value. So what I'm trying to say is here, there's a key, which I've got in my cache, but it's null. For some reason, I couldn't look that up, because the code in here goes and gets that item if it's not in the cache. But if it didn't find it last time, chances are it's not going to find it this time. Now, you might think, well, somebody might have put it there, so you've got to think, well, could this item suddenly magically appear? And this sort of thing isn't going to magically appear. So I know that I get it once and it's not there, I'm not going to bother looking up again. Because if this was, again, running thousands of times, and I just did this thing first to say if it's not in the table, so it's null, it couldn't differentiate between null and not being there. subtly different things. Yeah, and if you've been bitten by null or 0, saying if it's not there, and it's actually 0, which is a valid value, but yeah. So that's why I do the 2 lookups, which are more slightly expensive, but it's better to do a slightly expensive local lookup than this will go out to Azure every time and go, nope, still not there, still not there. Do that 1,000 times. That's a lot of Azure requests. Yeah, it's bandwidth, it's time. Whereas I've got it once, put in a null entry, or you could have some -1 or something like that, but just mark the fact that it's not there. So that's one of the things, but you don't always need to do that, yeah? If it's a local thing, then what's the expense of going in and seeing if it's there? Probably doesn't matter, yeah? So I could do the same with AD users and those sorts of things. I get them into a hash table and then use the key. Hashes are case insensitive as well, which is good, like most things in PowerShell. Thing to watch out for is if you use IDs. I will make all these slides available as well afterwards, by the way, if anybody wants to use them to get to sleep at night, fine by me. Be careful if you're using keys which are numeric, because although strings aren't case sensitive, numbers are type sensitive. So if you've put a number, and I get caught out by this quite a few times when I'm caching process IDs. So again, if I do a lot of Windows level stuff, so I'm getting process IDs, but I only want to do get process once, and then use those cached results. And I declare most things as int by default, but the process ID is actually an int32. So if you key it, if you store it on an int32 in your hash table, and you try and retrieve it as an int, 42 does not equal 42. You've got to actually look it up as an int32. So numbers are, well, not case sensitive, but type sensitive. So make sure you know what type, what numerical type your key is, because it can catch you out. I've already covered the where. You can use arrays for lookups. It can be quicker. Hash tables are expensive to build because it's got to hash things and put stuff in, but they're then very quick for lookups. Arrays, depending on whether they're sorted or not, you've got to then say, is it in this array? Right, I'm going to start element 0, element 1, element 2. So if you've got a very long array, and it's right at Sod's law says it will be right at the end of the array, then it's going to take a while. Now, do you sort your array? Do you then do binary searches? And so what's the right answer? Consultant's answer. It depends, yeah? A lot of the time I use arrays for short thing, but I know they're never going to get big. A couple of minutes left. Well, I get onto another slide. Caching commands. Very quick one. Have you ever thought about that? You're in a loop executing 10,000 times, and you're going to go and get a command. You're going to tell PowerShell to run something. Have you ever thought about how long it takes to actually find that command? Is it a commandlet? Is it an executable? If it's an executable, it's got to look down all the items in your path. If it's a commandlet, if you don't module qualify it, which makes things very bulky, then it's got to go and search various modules. So what you can do is you can cache the command. I'll come back to that one. This is kind of just trying justifying how long it will take. Obviously running short of time. As I say, you can module qualify. So you get-VM. If anybody uses get-VM in Hyper-V, yes, I'm going to stop talking in a minute, Rob, honest. But there's also one in the VMware, yeah? So which one do I want to call? I want to make sure I've loaded the right module, or you can just do Hyper-V / get-VM or vmware.vim.automation /. But then it gets a bit yeah, exactly like that one. Yeah, do you want to type that every time you want to do a get VM, and your script is only ever going to work with VMware, not with Hyper-V? No. So use get command. Modules, yeah. Modules is something I don't do much of because I generally write scripts for my software vendor customers, whereas my contribution to community is doing stuff like this and my troubleshooting scripts on GitHub rather than, here's a module that Guy wrote. So I leave that to other people. So what do I mean by that? Last thing I'm going to demonstrate is, have I already got this? Yeah, so I'm going to call, get you, this is a trivial example, but I can then say $listy, yeah? And what is listy? Well, yeah, he was in Red Dwarf, but it tells me, but hold on, I've not invoked it, I've just told it to get that, but I can now invoke it, yeah? So if I do a dot, $listy, with a, probably might work without a space, but I use a space anyway, because they're not the devil's work like some people think. Don't put spaces in variable names, it's possible, but it's really, really dumb. Spaces in file names, yes, this is the 21st century, yeah? We don't have to do 8.3 anymore. That's invoked the command, yeah? It's basically said, go and invoke it. It doesn't have to look it up, because it knows exactly where it is. Yeah? It doesn't have to look at any modules. I can do the same, because what you probably, if you're calling an external exe, you probably don't want a full path, put the full path into it. Remember, hard coding is the devil's work. You probably want to find it, because again, remember get command. So if I want to call iCackles, even though I could use setAckle, I can say get command iCack. I do cack a lot, actually. I use control space there, and that's the only one that matches. Control space will match X's as well, in commands. Yeah, it does everything for you. I can do that, assign it to a variable, and call it there. So then it doesn't have to, every time I call iCackles, if I'm doing it 1,000 times in a loop, I don't have to then go and tell it, oh, go and find iCackles, and it has to look down all your path elements, and if you've not done path optimization, which again, something I do a lot of in end-user computing, so it's put the Oracle Java paths, it's put everything else first, and then the path where these things actually are, probably System32, is last. So it's got to look through all these folders first of all, every time you execute it, 10,000 times. Yeah, let's cache it, and let's call whatever variable. I would call that something meaningful like, I don't know, maybe iCackles, or iCackles command, yeah? Or command for the northern folk, yeah? And then I can just invoke that, because I'm going to invoke it with no, I'll give it dot, that's the current directory. Yeah, and I'm running it. But it hasn't had to go and look down the path and everywhere else. Again, if you're doing it once, who cares? If you're doing it in a loop, I would care if I were you. Okay, sorry, I've run out of time, as I knew I would, because I always do, because I talk too much. But I will make these. What's the plan for making slides available? Do you know what the plan for making slides available is, Rob? GitHub. I'm not familiar with what's that? Right, yeah. I've heard about these Git things before. Nobody calls me a Git, but... So I hope that you found that useful, some teasers. There are a couple more slides with some extra stuff in. Plenty of examples on my GitHub repo. Feel free to ping me on Twitter. I'm him, if you can just stand the odd dad joke now and again. But life's too serious. Life's too short to be serious all the time. No one laughed? Go. Difficult audience. I won't give you my PowerShell ones, my IT one. So thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've got some thinking about your scripts. I'll be hanging around for a couple of hours, so feel free to come and badger me. Thank you very much.